Welcome, everyone. This week's episode, we're glad to have you with us as we continue through the book of Philippians. If my numbers are right, this is episode 209. Thanks to everybody who's been with us for this awesome ride. All right, what do we need from you? Well, we're trying to decide where to go next. Maybe you got a suggestion on what our next book should be. If you're listening on the podcast, you can reach out to us, or if you're on YouTube, you can comment down below. What book would you like to see go to next? I mean, we've been in Paul for a while. Maybe we'll do something completely different. I don't know. Let us know what you think. We want to produce content that's helpful and beneficial for you, so maybe you can give us a recommendation on that. Also, remember our question and response episode. Comment those down below if you're on YouTube, or you can send us a message on Facebook, YouTube, or not send us a message on YouTube, send us a message on Instagram. All those are great ways to reach out to us and really help to move us along. So without any further ado, I think that's all we have. There's a lot of announcements these days as we get towards the end of a book. But Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 and 11 will be our text today. Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me before, but you lacked an opportunity to act. Not that I speak from need, but I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. This week, we're coming into kind of the last truly substantive section in Philippians. We kind of got the little benediction and goodbye at the end. But before we get to that, this is really the last big section of content. I think it's a really overlooked and really, really cool section on how Christians related to each other. There's a good case to be made that what we're going to read is part of the purpose of the letter. It's part of Paul's motivation. Sometimes we hear that called the occasion of the letter. Why does the letter exist? What's the occasion that brought it about? Well, we're going to see what may be, in fact, some of that in the coming weeks. Specifically, Paul is going to offer his thanks for a monetary gift that the Philippians shared with him. We'll unpack that in coming weeks, but to place it in the context of the book, we'll give a quick review of the major sections so we can kind of see where does all this fit together. After the greeting, Paul expresses thanks and joy for their previous partnership in the gospel, which is likely a foreshadowing of this very section. And then he turns to the fact that the gospel is powerfully at work, even though he has been apparently sidelined. Even though he longs to depart and to be with Christ, he resolves to stay and labor for the furtherance of the gospel. As such, he calls on the Philippians to participate in this alongside him, even to the point of suffering. As they live in Christ with humility and service, they can achieve this blessed goal. Paul and Timothy and Epaphroditus, they're going to serve as examples of what it looks like to live worthy of the gospel. And so Paul's biography throughout the whole book, and specifically the time spent on Timothy and Epaphroditus, is really important for us to learn how we can be more effective servants of God as we move forward. Paul warns them about the dangers of exceptionalism that projects perfection, but is actually full of fleshliness. It projects perfection, but is actually full of fleshliness. Rather, instead of that, Paul shows that we should renounce our earthly measure of status and merit to find our worth in pursuing Christ through the gospel. True worth comes from pursuing and knowing Christ. After that, he addresses some disgruntled sisters who had previously labored together in the gospel with seeming effectiveness, and he calls for some brothers to facilitate their unity. With that, we get to the section we just finished up last week, where Paul turns to the Christian meditations, which is a practice that allows us to reframe our situations from the perspective of Christ. So, there's a whole lot going on, but kind of those various things you see in those themes repeated of Paul's joy and the suffering and the moving forward to holiness and Christian examples and the gospel going forward, those are kind of a lot of the main thrust of what we want to see, that we'll continue to see here in the letter. And it makes sense as to why this might be the purpose because of the various callbacks you can see within the letter. Today's examination is going to look at what we call the Philippian gift. We'll begin to kind of unpack that. Today's big idea is that joy and care must be reciprocal. Joy and care must be reciprocal. Our first idea is, number one, rejoice for concern. Number two, concern looks for actions. And number three, learn contentment. Rejoice for concern, concern looks for action, and learn contentment. Now this text, it starts with the word but, all right? The word but is a contrast word, so we want to ask, what's being contrasted? How is the Philippians following Paul's example and the God of peace being with them contrasted to Paul's rejoicing? And that seems like kind of a mystery. It could be that actually the rejoicing is contrasted with the anxiety of verse number 6, or maybe to the fighting of Euodia and Syntyche earlier in chapter 4. But I think something a little different is going on is that the Greek word there for but is actually sort of a Swiss Army knife conjunction. It serves a lot of purposes. It's most often translated but. However, it is almost as nearly translated and. And it can have other meanings such as moreover, now, then, for, and others. And in fact, in the King James Version, there's 300 places where you can't actually find a direct equivalent word. It just kind of get absorbed with other sayings, other meanings, figures of speech, things like that. So all that to say, I'm trying to build a case here. I'm inclined to think that the word but here is probably the wrong sense. Rather, Paul is probably using this to denote a shift in topic, whereas moreover or further might be a little bit better translation. As a word of warning, we've got to be careful with the kind of the leap we just did there, and make sure we give it a little more backbone. Specifically, if you look at the Christian Standard Bible, the English Standard Bible or English Standard Version, and the New English Translation, they all render it kind of in that manner. They just kind of omit it and just let it move forward. We need to be careful because we can't just take a word off a list. We can't just take a word off a list of possible translations and pick the one that we think is kind of convenient. But when reputable translations go along with a certain meaning and the context comes together, that's when we can, kind of say, hey, maybe the New American Standard Bible didn't get this one right. What we really can't do and what we want to avoid doing is saying, oh, every major translation does it this way, but there's this one thing on this list here that kind of suits my purposes and I like it better, so I'm going to ignore all of those translators and go with my idea. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing is looking between major translations and looking at possible major English translations, looking at possible translations of the word and then the context and kind of saying, hey, I think we kind of go this way along with these other translations. All right, all that to say, we don't want to spend our time parsing Greek conjunctions, but we do want to note that Paul's rejoicing was in the fact that they expressed their concern from him. This points specifically to the gift that he's thanking them for, that gift is really a demonstration of their heart. Paul is encouraged by the fact that people are thinking about him. And I think a correction is needed here. I think a correction here is needed for some people because I think some people are really grieved and hate it when other people are caring or concerned about them. And I think sometimes that we insist, even when we're struggling, we do need help to not worry about me. Sometimes our pursuit of self-reliance is really, truly a thief of joy. Now, that said, we shouldn't walk around like an Eeyore, just like looking for sympathy and attention. But if you're struggling and someone expresses concern, there should be some level of joy in that and not guilt. Next, Paul says that they were concerned about him, but they lacked an opportunity. This second point shifts from the responsibility of the person receiving the concern to the part of the people expressing the concern. And we'll see these two things go hand in hand, that their concern caused his joy, which facilitated their relationship, and then it kind of goes back and forth. A theme we've seen several times in Philippians. Paul sees this gift he's receiving as an expression of that concern, but he knows that their care and concern were present even before the gift or the opportunity to share it was there. He says, you were concerned about me, but you lacked an opportunity. In this case, as our point describes, care is going to seek an opportunity to act. It almost reads as though the Philippians were concerned about Paul, and as soon as the windows open for them to give this gift, they jump on it. Like, oh, we can give, we can help, let's do it. And those are two components of this that are really important that I want to point out as we think about how to care for other people. One is the willingness, and two is the looking. The willingness for it and the looking for it, and they're both connected to each other, really. You look at the word compassion in the Bible. We think about compassion as concern or feeling bad for people, but it's not just an emotion or a feeling of concern. It is the motivation for action. As Jesus is moved with compassion, he does something. He feeds the multitudes. He heals the sick. He offers, advice or whatever. That compassion, if it doesn't have an action to it, isn't really biblical compassion. We should not be satisfied to look at people who are hurting, struggling, or otherwise suffering and say, well, I feel bad. I've done my duty. In many ways, that's the attitude of James, where we say to someone in need, depart in peace, be warmed and filled. There should be a willingness to act, which motivates the looking that we mentioned a moment ago. The kind of concern and compassion doesn't just take half-hearted glances for something to do and be like, oh, well, I can't find anything. I guess I don't want help. Instead, it searches for it. There have been many times that I was struggling, or saw someone struggling rather, and I didn't know how to help them other than to say, cheer up and I'll pray for you, and then not. But that's another story. But I would see a congregation member who would look at the situation that I was just totally, dumbfuzzled by how I was gonna help, and they find this super creative solution that I could never have thought of. But fortunately, I have their example, and it's something that provides aid and help. The reason they did that was because that concern was on their heart in a right way, and they pondered it and ruminated and thought through it over the principles in the Christian meditations that we've talked about. And through that process, they were blessed with an idea to serve that person in need. Those thoughts of excellence and purity and righteousness and honorableness and praiseworthiness, they all worked in their mind to find the thing they needed to do. Last thing, we read Paul's statement that qualifies this joy. He was joyful for the generosity they showed, but he's careful to temper that with his perspective, which we're going to see in the next several episodes. Specifically, Paul wants to make sure it's clear that while he was encouraged by what they did, Paul finds Christ sufficient. If you'll recall Paul's statement of faith in chapter 1, he believes that living is Christ and dying is gain. Even in a jail cell, Paul is sustained by Christ. So the Philippian gift was an incredible encouragement, whose place we're going to learn about in short order. But this gift did not shore up an inadequacy in Paul, because he had learned to be content in all circumstances. This, too, is going to be part of our big idea next week and the several weeks after that. But to begin to unpack it, contentment is to be satisfied with what one has and not to desire more from a place of dissatisfaction. Essentially, it's the ability to rejoice in the fact that your current means are sufficient. Instead of asserting that, I'll be satisfied if I had fill in the blank, you would just be, joyful and satisfied now. Paul says he's learned in whatever state he's in to be content. And he'll go on to unpack the various spectrum of things that he's learned to be content with and how to do so. But spoiler alert, it's Jesus, okay? And even if you didn't know how Paul, even if you had read this book before, but you don't know how is Paul going to learn to be content in all things, well, if you kind of read Philippians, you kind of know it's Jesus. So he recognizes that Jesus is at the center of it all. And while this joy is immense at their generosity and care, that joy does not come from discontentment. We might ask, if he's not joyful because he was longing for something that he received, what was the cause of the joy then? It's like he got a gift, and he's not joyful because he needed it. What was going to make him joyful? Well, we'll get to that in a few weeks. That's a mystery that really shows us Paul's incredible heart and perspective. So where does that leave us? This week, we want to, again, comment and focus on the model of closeness between Paul and the Philippians, how they just kind of bounce off of each other. They had immense closeness for one another, and Paul was heartened and rejoiced by the fact that the Philippians thought of him and cared for him, while the Philippians were concerned and sought to find tangible ways to help Paul. They weren't content with just spoken concern, but they found ways to support him. The most effective church communities I've ever been a part of found ways to do this exceptionally well. And church communities that I've been a part of that were ineffective did not do this very well. Those who are effective find practical and meaningful ways to support one another besides with just words and well wishes. So here's the deal. Sometimes our situations are bigger than we can handle, and sometimes our situations are bigger than any of our church members can handle. Sometimes we have work, family, health, and other situations that nobody's going to fix. It's still going to be there tomorrow. And we have to plead that God will intercede. However, the people of God can support and be a part of that solution. For example, if you have cancer, most Christians can't make that go away, but they can sit with you as you're getting your treatments. They can make meals that don't make you sick. They can clean your house when you're too exhausted from those sorts of things and provide you continual encouragement. They can support you through it. Even though they can't fix it, they can make it bearable so that God and the doctors and God working through the doctors can take care of the rest. And so we see these two sides, the joy of receiving from people who generously offer and the joy of charitable giving and generous giving, and the way these two things work together. Without both of these things, without a joyful reception or a joyful giving, this becomes a cycle of just frustration and annoyance. But whenever both sides care about one another and care and joyfully receive and then joyfully share, it's a beautiful cycle instead of painful. So do you allow others to serve you, or do you resist it? Do you try to be self-sufficient to the point of your own detriment? Has your pride ever kept you from taking help that you really needed because you didn't want to humble yourself enough to admit that you needed help? Is there help you need today which you have delayed getting because you didn't want to show needs? Do you look for ways to help people? Are you creative in finding places to effectively support and love people? Do you wish them well, or do you search, look, ponder for places where you can help? Who are the effective servants in the church you go to? Could you go to them and learn how to look at situations to find ways to help people in need so that you can find the joy of service and they can have the joy of receiving? Thanks so much for joining us today on 15 Minutes in Big Idea. Today's big idea: joy and care must be reciprocal.